What forges a person's identity? Name, his body, his blood, his memories, his actions, the way others look at him? It's a complex question we've all asked ourselves, and one we're going to ask ourselves today about the main character in Tower of God, Baam. This video won't be an analysis video as I usually do, but rather a theory. Two theories in fact, one being a very old theory, of which I'm not the author, but which I'm going to supplement a little with more recent information, the theory on the identity of the Prince of Jahad, generally referred to by the acronym BaZa, and a second which this time will focus on everything surrounding Baam's resurrection and the reasons for his imprisonment in that famous cave. A theory that was constructed by Asriel, with the help of Electrica and others over the course of our discussions, and which I'm going to modify a little. And before I start, I'd like to point out that this video was written when I was at chapter 578, the 161st chapter of season 3, and so this video spoils up to that point, and if you watch it a long time later, it may already be out of date on some points. Anyway, today we're going to start our first Tower of God theory video. Today we're going to ask what Baam's true identity is. Well, let's get one thing straight right off the bat. The purpose of this first theory is to say that Baam is Jahad's son, nothing more, nothing less. Now right away this may seem completely absurd. Ever since the Floor of Death arc, we've known that Baam's father is V, Arlen having refused Jahad's advances because she had promised herself to V. What's more, Han Sung-yu repeats in the Hidden Floor arc that Baam is V's son. Except that in truth, it's much more complex and nebulous than that. But before we get into all that, it's worth recalling what is surely one of the most important mysteries in the Tower of God plot, the identity of the Prince of Jahad. As a reminder, in chapter 239 of season 2, Garam tells us that Jahad climbed the tower to the 134th floor, then wished to stop the ascent in order to become king, and blocked access to the 135th floor, leading to war with Arlen and V, who wished to continue the ascent. Garam will also say that Jahad wanted to entrust the continuation of the tower's ascent to his descendants, something impossible since his blood was too powerful for a woman to give birth to one of his children. Incidentally, this story of Jahad's descendants continuing the ascent is an old element that SIU mentioned on its blog a long time ago, saying that some of the tower's inhabitants hope that the ascent will resume when Jahad's only son will be born. This is non-canon lore, so take it with a grain of salt, but it's consistent with Jahad's statement that he's leaving the rest of the ascension to his descendants. In any case, it is in order to enable Jahad to have a child that Gustang will set up the Jahad princess system, in order to create a woman capable of carrying the child who will continue the ascension. Except that Jahad never wanted the ascension to resume, and deliberately sabotaged the entire Jahad princess system, notably by preventing a princess from activating 2 of the 13 months at the same time, driving her mad with the ghost of the 13 months. The most obvious case is that of Anne Jahad, the daughter of Gustang and Eurasia Blossom, who was to put an end to the competition between princesses, reunite the 13 months, and be able to bear Jahad's children, but ended up completely mad and locked up. Anyway, for the details of all this, I refer you to the video on Jahad's princesses, as it's rather complex, there are a lot of subplots, and I've already untangled all that in that video. In addition, there's also everything to do with the princes of the Red Light District, who we know are the greatest shame of the 10 great families and the Jahad family, that they have inherited Jahad's blood and that they possess rings which, when put together, will form half the key to the 135th floor, the other half being in the 13 months gathering. I'm not going to start theorizing about them because otherwise the video might get pretty long, but it also feels a bit like an experiment aimed at enabling Jahad to have some sort of offspring, although it could very well be something else. Anyway, all this to say that it's pretty clear that the existence of a descendant of Jahad, who will continue the ascent of the tower, is a key plot issue, that many people want him to come, and that Jahad seems prepared to do anything to ensure that he has no descendants and that the ascent of the tower never resumes. And so, finally, we come to the Prince of Jahad, and here, we'll have to go back to chapter 0 of season 2. At the end of this chapter, Jaina Repelista, who I've already explained in numerous videos, was up to her neck in all kinds of stuff, says, "Now the real story begins. The boring times are over, so it's time for them to appear. The Prince of Jahad will soon return." SIU will then reveal the title of Season 2, The Return of the Prince. We'll come back to this later, as it's a really important passage, but this is the first time the title of Prince of Jahad will be mentioned. SIU will also point out in the end of chapter note that, officially, there is no Prince of Jahad. Repelista therefore refers to a well-kept secret. Now let's move on to the second scene in which the Prince of Jahad is mentioned, at the end of the Battle of the Workshop, in chapter 107 of season 2, during the discussion between Gustang and the radio. Well, first of all, who is that man on the radio? I mean, the guy seems to know about the existence of the Prince of Jahad, but on top of that, in chapter 56 of season 2, he addresses Gustang as young man when the guy is several tens of thousands of years old, with Gustang then replying that he's too impatient for his age, as if he were talking to a grandpa. Finally, in chapter 85 of season 2, he'll say that it was he who enabled Gustang to get control of the Battle of the Workshop, and Gustang will more or less make us understand that the guy on the radio had already guessed the purpose he had through this arc. In short, it's obvious to me that there's only one possible person with such enormous knowledge and influence who's much older than Jahad and the family heads. It's obviously Makseth, the creator of the workshop. And last but not least, Makseth refers to the humans of the tower, as if he were familiar with humans outside the tower, which ties in with the non-canon lore that the atelier would also exist outside the tower. But anyway, as you can imagine, I'm going to save all these elements for a future theory. Just put it in the back of your mind in the meantime and check out the lore video on the workshop for more details on this group. It's really one of the most fascinating and mysterious parts of the lore, I think. Anyway, what's important to remember for this video is the last question he'll ask Gustang: who is the true Prince of Jahad, the one who will pass the final test of the tower? Here, not only is there a direct mention of the Prince of Jahad, but also the fact that he would indeed be the one to reach the top of the tower. However, the identity of this prince can be confusing, because while we can of course think of Baam, given that the arc was centered around him, there's also Wangnan, with whom we also began this season 2, named the Prince's Return. The way the scene is cut reinforces this ambiguity, showing us Gustang's response by linking one frame with Baam and another with Wangnan. But for me, there are two things that make it clear that it's Baam we're talking about here. The first is that there are several princes of the red light district. There's Wangnan, Karaka, and most likely the captain. What's more, they are seen as a disgrace to the Jahad family and the 10 great families, as a mistake. Yet Makseth insists that he is talking about the true Prince of Jahad, as opposed to the false princes of the red light district. And for me, all this is confirmed by what Ripalista said in chapter 0 of season 2. She does say, separately, that it's time for them to appear, in the plural, and then that the Prince of Jahad will return. In short, she clearly distinguishes between the princes of the red light district and the real Prince of Jahad to whom Makseth refers. It therefore seems obvious that the Prince of Jahad is none other than Baam, especially since he's the one Gustang is constantly testing, whether in the Battle of the Workshop, the Floor of Death, the Hidden Floor, and so on. He obviously doesn't give a damn about Wangnan. And all this leads us to the third reference to the Prince of Jahad, which we'll see long afterwards, in chapter 134 of season 3, when Kun begins to read the Forbidden Book before the assembly of bourgeois Pobidao, inside which we'll see mention of the 10 great families, Icarus, and the Prince of Jahad. A book he felt was too well constructed to be just a cheap hoax. But what's most interesting is when Gustang, in chapter 138 of season 3, more or less makes Kun realize that part of what was written in that book is true, and that the real story surrounding the 10 great families and Jahad is quite different from the official story. The story that his own family, the symbol of knowledge, has passed on to the tower's inhabitants. And that's where we get to the crux of what I wanted to talk about. Gustang will confess to Kun that his aim is in fact to re-establish the historical truth, and that he needs Baam to do this. And for me, it's all very clear. There's certainly everything about Icarus, which seems to be linked to Traumerei and the memories he sealed in the Leviathan, memories that Baam could reveal, since he knows them. It's also clear from the most recent chapters that Gustang intends to use Baam to lure Traumerei to a certain location. But for me, the main point is that Gustang wants the tower to know that the Prince of Jahad, the one who will take over the Ascension, has returned, and that he is no more and no less than Baam. Remember, the title of Season 2 of Tower of God is The Return of the Prince. So yes, we're currently in the middle of Season 3, but there's one thing you need to know. Season 2 shouldn't have stopped at the end of the last station arc, when Gustang announced that a rift had begun to form. Basically, it was Nava Webtoons editors who forced him to start a Season 3, as Season 2 was far too long, especially compared to Season 1. This also forced SIU to slightly modify the transition between the last station and Cage arcs, by making an ellipsis when he would have liked to make a real arc about what happens between the two. But anyway, when was this Season 2 supposed to end? Well, not before the Nest, given the sequence of events and their continuity. Not after the Nest either, as once again, the next arc arrives immediately afterwards with no downtime. To sum up, we're currently still in what should be the Season 2 of Tower of God, the famous Return of the Prince. And I think it's precisely at the end of this whole big war arc between Pobidao and Lopobia, in which Gustang's real aim is to restore the true story, to reveal to the world the identity of the Prince of Jahad, that Season 2 should have concluded. A conclusion in which the whole tower learns that Baam is none other than Jahad's son, and that he has returned to resume the Ascension. A conclusion in which the whole tower learns, literally, that the Prince has returned. Okay, that's all well and good, but it still doesn't explain how Baam isn't V's son. And now we'll have to go back to chapters 239 to 241 of season 2. Right from the start, Garam tells us that she's only going to tell Baam a small part of the truth because he wouldn't be able to handle the whole story. Inevitably, learning that you have to kill your own father and that this father himself has already killed you once can be complicated, especially as there are surely things about Arlen that aren't pretty. Also, you may note that at no point does Garam say that Baam is V's son, and that's one of the big points to note about all this. Nobody actually mentions Baam as V's son. Gustang will only call him Arlen's son. Even V himself doesn't mention Baam in his suicide note, even though he's supposed to be his son and that Jahad killed him. By the way, we need to talk about this suicide because it's frankly bizarre. At what point do you commit suicide by telling your wife to forget everything and go back to her friends, who include the guy who made war on them, hunted them down and then murdered their baby in cold blood? It just doesn't make sense. There's something really unclear about all this, and it leads us to another very important element to consider, that of the fallible narrator. The story we're given here is not only incomplete, but based on the testimony of a single person, Arlen Grace. These are her words, her version of things, a version that may well be romanticized or even partly untrue. Arlen probably wanted this pocket to be discovered, or she wouldn't have bothered writing all this. At no point would she have written anything negative about herself, while on the other hand, she spits out her hatred for Jahad, who killed her baby, and of course she puts absolutely no nuance into it and describes him as a real monster, which he probably is, but you have to bear in mind that Arlen's words aren't totally reliable, especially as she went completely mad at one point. Whether it's V's death, which is highly suspicious, or her relationship with Jahad, we can't be sure of anything. Perhaps her relationship with him was more ambiguous than she'd have us believe. After all, relationships can be very complex and chaotic, and we know almost nothing about the group of 13 great warriors, their ascension, or the relationships they had with each other. But perhaps, and this is the most radical solution, Jahad raped her outright. After all, SIU has already mentioned stories of rape by members of 10 great families with Angel, so this theme is not taboo with him. As for counter-arguments, you could say that Baam doesn't physically resemble Jahad, but in fact he doesn't look like V either. V looks much more like Hats, for example. By the way, there's a nice little theory by Azriel suggesting that Hats is in fact a distant descendant of V, who may well have had a fleeting relationship with a female inhabitant during his ascent of the tower, especially as he was known to be close to the normal people of the tower. This could explain why Hats is so strong that he can resist and even beat members of the 10 great families, even though he's not one of them and is extremely young. But anyway, if Baam resembles anyone, it's Arlen. Then there's the fact that the Johansung's data version calls Baam the son of V, as does Kunedan's data, but this is justified simply by the fact that Hansung told him. He'll also say that V was the one who had the greatest tension in his Shinsu in their group, but won't insist much on that. He won't tell Baam that his tension is particularly high, for example. He won't mention any resemblance to V, in fact, and will even be a little dubious. So where does Yu Hansung get this information from? Well, let's put it in context. Hansung Yu was a rather young and idealistic member of the Fugue at the time, still a regular. We know that he means a lot to Hendolok Blood Matter, as I've explained in numerous videos, and that this makes him in essence someone important to the Fugue. So it makes sense for Fugue executives to reveal some of the truth to him, including the existence of V, and a story similar to the one Garam told Jahad, which is already a pretty well kept secret. As for the prediction that V's son would arrive in the hidden floor, it's surely some kind of Fugue plan to facilitate Baam's passage to the hidden floor and retrieve that famous bracelet at the same time. But generally speaking, while all the older members of the Fugue, as well as the highest ranking executives must know about Arlen and V, since they fought for them during Genesis, I think there are hardly any members who know that Baam is in fact Jahad's son. Luslek may even be the only one. And it's understandable. Luslek, Fug's leader, was himself V's former servant and created Fug to continue the opposition Fi had started against Jahad. Now imagine what the son of the man who created Fug would mean to Fug. It would literally make him the group's legitimate leader, the ultimate symbol of rebellion against Jahad. On the other hand, imagine Luslek revealing to the other members of Fug that Baam is in fact Jahad's son, the son of their ultimate enemy, a son whose lightning progress as an irregular will quickly make him more powerful than any other member of Fug, with no guarantee that he will join them. Right away, Baam would become a real threat. Already that some Fug members wanted to melt him down with the thorn to use as a weapon in the Battle of the Workshop, now they're just gonna want to kill him. And so making Fug members believe that Baam is V's son is just the best possible strategy, and so far, the one and only person we've seen mention Baam as V's son belongs to the Fug. Finally, to end all this, there's one last major point. When Baam asks Gustang what his father was like in chapter 258 of season 2, Gustang coldly replies that he won't talk about it because he's the worst person he's ever met, and that Baam will eventually understand why. And here I'd like to remind you what Jahad means to Gustang. First of all, Jahad has blocked the tower, preventing further ascent, and Gustang's scientific side makes him very curious about what's up there, so it must be a real frustration not to be able to find out the truth about the tower, and that's why he's been so keen to create a way for Jahad to have descendants. But that's almost anecdotal compared to the rest. After all, Jahad is the man who hijacked the system of Jahad princesses that Gustang himself had created in order to prevent any possibility of the ascension being resumed. And above all, the man who caused his own daughter, whom he had with his wife and fellow ascension companion, Eurasia Blossom, to go mad. An affair that led to Gustang and Blossom splitting up and even outright forbidding marriages between their two families. And add to this the fact that Jahad is clearly the reason why the war against V and Arlen began, leading to the loss of his two companions. In short, Jahad is responsible for the death or disappearance of two of his friends, the breakup with the woman he's loved for probably tens of thousands of years, his daughter's madness and confinement, a stagnation of knowledge, and so on. And so now, since Baam's father is the worst person he's ever known, tell me how V could have done worse than all that. V, who was described as the nicest, most human guy in the group, the only one to stay close to the inhabitants and refuse immortality. Like, the guy sounds like a real saint. The truth may be more nuanced, but it seems very complicated to me that he could stir up such visceral hatred in Gustang that he hates him more than the man who destroyed his marriage by manipulating him and against whom he wants to start a war. So it's clear to me that Gustang is talking about Jahad here, not V. Finally, there's another, far more logical explanation for Jahad's murder of Baam. We've seen just how desperate Jahad is not to have any descendants, that it's an absolute necessity for him, so that he can never ascend again. In fact, one might well ask why this sudden obsession with stopping the ascension and becoming king. Why, on the 134th floor, did he suddenly decide to stop everything, to the point of going to war with his friend and the woman he loved, and even killing his own son? Because I think the reasons are much deeper than just a lust for power, that it's more than just a desire to become king, but again, I'll save that for another video. In the end, this was the real reason for Baam's murder, to avoid at all costs the existence of an heir who would continue the ascension in his place, and not a simple matter of jealousy of V, who had fathered a child with the woman he loved. Jahad knew that Arlen and V were together when they rebelled against him, so why didn't he get angry right away? Why was he so mad when he found out Arlen was pregnant that he went after her himself to kill her child, when if Arlen and V were together, it would have happened sooner or later? In short, once again, everything points to Baam being his son, which is why he killed him. And precisely now that we know Baam's origin, it makes a good transition to the second theory that completes this one, where we'll be interested in what happened after Baam's death, to find out who he really is. What follows Baam's death is very unclear, and even the way in which the few elements we do know unfolded is open to theory. So I'm going to take a little detour before getting to the heart of this theory, by talking about everything that happens between Baam's death and his resurrection. To do this, I'm going to take up Azriel's theoretical work on the chronology of events and everything concerning Baam's cave, and by the way, I'm putting the link to his theory in the description because it's a great piece of work and it differs a little from mine. And so, to begin with, we're going to digress for a while to explain why, according to this theory, Baam's cave is located outside the tower, while Rachel's place was deep inside the 43rd floor. Okay, when you put it like that, it doesn't make any sense, but you'll get the idea. It's really quite a complex case, and it's very easy to get tangled up in it, so I'm going to remind you of the basics. There's the tower, which is itself divided into three parts: the inner tower, the outer tower, and the central zone, or intermediate tower, whichever you prefer. I detail all this in the lore video on the tower, and outside this tower lies the outside world, the infinitely vast world described by Urek Mazino and Jahad's data on the hidden floor, a world in which countless stars shine in the sky, the world from which all irregulars come. But then, when you think about it, something doesn't seem quite right. Baam's cave should logically be located outside the tower, since he comes from the outside, at least after his resurrection. He says so himself on several occasions. So far so good. Where it gets weird though, is if we ask about the world where Rachel lives, beyond that impassable light for Baam, which he had reached in his cave after creating a mountain of stone. We know almost nothing about this world, but the very few times Baam and Rachel mention it are very interesting. Indeed, Rachel will describe to Baam this world where she lives as a world of light full of happiness, where fruit grows on trees that God has created, where festivals are held regularly, a world of joy without darkness, in which the chosen children dance and play. But in reality, Rachel was lying to Baam. This world was in no way a world of light. In the Floor of Death arc, Baam tells Rachel about Arlen Grace. That woman thought the place we were in was paradise. That's why she left this place. But Rachel, there was nothing heavenly about where we were, was there? I don't know as much as you, but I know how much you hate this place. We'll come back to Arlen Grace's case later on, but in fact, from the very first chapter, Rachel tells us that she can't stand living in what she describes as a dark world, in stark contrast to the idyllic description she was able to give in Baam. But the strangest and most obvious point is that if Rachel's place, that famous paradise Arlen Grace spoke of, is in the outside world, how come she's never seen the stars? And why is she talking about reaching the top of the tower as the only way of ever seeing them? As you can see, it doesn't make sense. And for those about to say that this can be explained by Baam's cave being inside the tower, there are a whole host of reasons why this isn't possible. But in any case, SIU has already more or less said that it's outside the tower. Indeed, on October 3rd, 2010, shortly after Tower of God began publication, a fan asked SIU if the tower, the outside world and Baam's cave were different places, to which SIU replied that the three locations were not each a different world, but that Baam's cave was in a different place from the tower, so in the outside world. However, everything points to the fact that the place where Rachel lives is actually inside the tower, and there are many indications that this place is in fact the 43rd floor. Let's digress for a moment and talk about the real and fake floor of death. Indeed, at the very beginning of the Floor of Death arc, Evan tells us of a real Floor of Death, which would be located in the center of the floor, under the corpse of the administrator that Enryu killed. It's in this true Floor of Death that the arc's entire plot will unfold, but it's precisely the false Floor of Death that we're going to be interested in. Already we know that in the absence of the administrator, who regulates the Shinsu, life on the Floor of Death is extremely difficult, as the density of Shinsu is very low. People die quickly of old age or lack of food. In short, they have a miserable life, except for those present on the real Floor of Death, thanks to the soul device that Gustang has set up, which locks them in but makes them immortal at the same time, and also thanks to the whole pipe system. In addition, you can see that it's generally been a dark world since it was ravaged by Enryu. This is clearly seen when the train reaches the floor and all the lights go out. In short, as you can see, an inhabitant living in this false Floor of Death would be condemned to a short, miserable life in a dark world. A world ultimately very similar to the one described by Rachel. It's amusing to think that if Rachel had really come from the false 43rd floor, she might have recognized it when she arrived, before plunging into the real Floor of Death. Except that she didn't. She was in Yura's briefcase when she entered the Floor of Death and never saw anything other than the real floor in this arc. As you can see, the connections are beginning to be made. But then, how do you explain that Baam's cave is in the outside world, that the world Rachel lived in is the 43rd floor, and that the two are connected like this? And what could be the link with Arlen Grace? Well, I think the truth is that Arlen never really made it outside the tower. Well, yes and no. I think she simply went to the cave where Baam was locked up. But to explain all this and get to the question of Baam's cave, we're going to have to take a look at the chronology of events. I warned you, this theory is full of little detours. When we listen to what Garam is telling us, we have a fairly logical timeline running through our heads. Arlen gives birth to Baam and raises him to the 43rd floor. Jahad kills Baam. Arlen tries to commit suicide several times but is unable to do so because of his immortality. V commits suicide by leaving that famous letter. Arlen doesn't return to her former companions and starts wandering the tower in search of a way out, carrying Baam's corpse and using spells to protect his body from putrefaction. She eventually finds a place without Jahad or floor administrator, in her own words, makes her prophecy about Enryu's arrival, Baam's return, etc., and offers Baam's corpse to the god of the outside for resurrection. Following this, Enryu will arrive on the 43rd floor, exterminate Jahad's fanatics, kill the administrator, and leave this famous thorn behind. Except that the chronology of these events is not necessarily the same. Indeed, while everything concerning Arlen probably unfolds as described above, certain elements lead us to believe that Enryu's arrival does not take place after Arlen's exit from the tower, and that SIU may well have tricked us. In fact, when Garam mentions Arlen's disappearance, following which Jahad placed his fanatics on the 43rd floor to erase all trace of Baam, I don't think it's the moment she left the tower, but the moment she started wandering the tower with Baam's corpse. And it was after that that Enryu arrived in the tower to exterminate the Jahad fanatics, while Arlen was still in the tower. In fact, the impression we get that Enryu arrived after Arlen's exit from the tower just comes from the fact that Garam tells us Enryu's arrival after Arlen's story, and our brain makes a shortcut by imagining that the chronology of events is the same as the chronology of Garam's storytelling. But this is where SIU has tricked us, because you'll see that the fact that Enryu's arrival takes place while Arlen is still in the tower is far more logical. First of all, it's easy to assume that Arlen could have gone unnoticed by her companions, given her status of irregular, and therefore the impossibility for the guides or anyone else to predict anything about her, especially as, given her mastery of magic, she could very well have kept a low profile by using all the spells she had mastered. What's more, Garam tells us that for a very long time, she wandered all over the tower. I'm sure you're all aware of just how gigantic the tower is, and such a task could well have held it for tens of thousands of years. But the most interesting point is when, at the very end of her diary, she says she has found a way out of the tower, after which she makes her prophecy. She writes, "I finally found a way out of here, a place without Jahad or the administrator. I don't know where this place is, but all I want is to see a vast sky and bright stars like in my hometown. But even if I leave this place, I can't leave behind the lack of my love and the pain I feel when I think of my dead child. So I've made a decision. I'm going to offer my child's body to a god of the outside. One day, the power of this god will enter this child's body and he will wake up. This child will one day open the door of this tower and return, and by his hands he will avenge my love and put an end to the war we started. He will destroy this corrupt power and bring truth to this tower. God's messenger will place the red thorn in this child's hands, and this child will cut the greedy king's throat with it. He will then find the key that this king has hidden and open the door. He will guide all the people in this tower to a higher place." And if I've quoted all this prophecy to you, it's not for stylistic effect, but because almost every word and even every image illustrating them is important. So let's take a closer look. First of all, this prophecy was made before Enryu's arrival, because it prophesies his arrival from the tower, speaking of this messenger of God, who will put the red thorn in Baam's hands. But then it's not consistent with what I was saying earlier, that Arlen left the tower after Enryu's arrival. Except that when she says she's found a way out of the tower, that she's found a place without Jahad and without an administrator, she's saying that she doesn't know exactly where it is because it doesn't exist yet, that she's just sensed it. It's a prophecy she's making, a prediction of the future, with a power similar to that of the guides, but far more powerful. We know that Jahad claims to be able to see all cause and effect, on a level similar to that of a god, and therefore far superior to that of normal guides, so it's possible that Arlen has the same power, or even greater, since she predicts Jahad's death, and so far, her prophecy is going rather well. Especially as we've seen that, on the hidden floor, Jahad was surprised to see that Baam was alive, so he hadn't foreseen his resurrection. By the way, I'd like to refer you to the lore video on the guides, where I explain in detail how all this works, with the different layers of determinism and all, because it's really important to understand but far too complicated to go into here. Besides, it's probably one of the most interesting lore videos I've ever seen, and I'm going to be using it as a basis for a lot of theories in the future, so yeah, check it out. But anyway, in this prophecy, she talks about a place without Jahad and without an administrator, and talks about wanting to see a vast sky and bright stars again, like in her hometown. However, the image we're shown to represent this is not the outside world with its stars, but the roof of a floor with its lights on the ceiling, as we've seen many times throughout the webtoon. So she's not talking about the outside of the tower yet, but about a place that doesn't yet exist inside the tower, which she sees in her prophecy, where there would be neither Jahad nor administrator. Yet there's only one such place in the tower, the 43rd floor, after Enryu's passage. That 43rd floor, where she raised Baam, and which she no longer recognizes after Jahad has erased all trace of her and Baam, and Enryu has completed the job by raising the entire floor to the ground. And of course, on top of all that, she's gone half mad. But then, what's this way out of the tower? Why did she need a place without Jahad or an administrator to do it? Well, there's an extremely simplistic theory that just might work. Arlen simply dug out the outer wall of the tower. Okay, it sounds a bit stupid when you put it like that, but when you think about it, the tower is a tower. So as you move further and further away from its center, eventually you're going to hit the wall. So all you'd have to do is break through the wall to get outside the tower. But if it were that simple, Urek would have done it long ago. Besides, he's probably stupid enough to have already tried it, thinking it would work. In fact, I think it's impossible to do this because of the administrator, who would prevent people from attacking the wall with a spell of any kind. After all, they're the masters of their floor, so they can do whatever they like, teleport people, even erase them instantly, impose special spells, make a wall indestructible, modify the structure of the space to send people back automatically. In short, we can imagine all kinds of things, and no one, apart from Enryu and Phantominium, can evade their authority. Except that, with no administrator on the 43rd floor, there's no one left to keep the wall of the floor intact. That's why I think Arlen simply dug out the walls of the 43rd floor, thinking she could get out of the tower that way. And she did well to believe it, for she had predicted it in her prophecy. As we can see, in her prophecy, she sees herself leaving the tower, as symbolized by this sort of luminous cross, which we also see in the very first chapter, when Baam enters the tower. And it's after that, that she says she'll offer her baby's body to an outer god, so that his strength can enter her body, and that he'll enter the tower and be more or less its savior, freeing it from the dictatorship and stagnation imposed by Jahad, to finally resume the ascent and reach the top of the tower. In short, it's clear that in this prediction, Baam is portrayed as a savior, almost as a messiah, and that Arlen's prophecy is more than positive. It idealizes him completely. But things don't really go according to plan. No matter how hard she dug, she still couldn't see a single star. All it looked like was a huge, dark cave with no sky to look at. But I think it was here, in this place well and truly considered to be outside the tower, in what would later become the cave in which Baam would be locked up, and which would be linked to the 43rd floor in which Rachel lived, if you've been following correctly, that she was able to make contact with the famous god of the outside. By the way, if this story about digging into the wall sounds absurd, it's quite conceivable that this cave was already there in the first place, or that Enryu built it himself before leaving to create a link between the god of the outside, whose messenger he is according to prophecy, and the inside of the tower. And this brings us to the most interesting and ultimately central point of this theory, Baam's resurrection. The word resurrection isn't really appropriate though. In fact, the word resurrection suggests that someone is brought back to life, and by someone we mean that the person resurrected is identical to the person they were before. In Baam's case, however, it's difficult to judge because he was just a baby, with no personality and no memories yet fully formed. And in the end, even Arlen doesn't speak of resurrection in his prophecy, but of the fact that the force of the god of the outside will enter his body and awaken him. In fact, the god of the outside just breathed life into a corpse. He didn't really resurrect Baam. The real Baam, the original, is well and truly dead. But the important thing is what the god of the outside did when he breathed life into Baam. Because yes, that's not all he did. He gave this body a special power, a unique power that Baam has possessed since the very beginning of the story, a terrifying power that Arlen hadn't envisaged in his prophecy. I'm talking of course about this sun, this power that devours everything. I'll refer you to the video explaining Baam's powers because I go into great detail about how this sun works and why we know that this power was present in Baam from the start, when he entered the tower, but it's clear to me that this all-devouring power was inserted into Baam's body by the god of the outside when he resurrected him, and this Arlen hadn't predicted. She knew the god of the outside would give some of his power to Baam, but I don't think she knew it would be of this nature. Especially as I don't think she was able to get out of the tower either, that this god of the outside, whom she probably thought would get her out since she'd predicted it in her prophecy, didn't in truth get her wish. I think this god of the outside is on a stratum of destiny even higher than her, and that he just manipulated her in the same way that Jahad manipulated Kel-Helem and his ability to see destiny if you like, all to serve his own purpose. And that's when Arlen realized that her prophecy was partially false and updated it. Indeed, while Arlen described Baam as the savior of the tower in his diary prophecy, Rachel tells us that Baam was not born to save the tower, but is a monster destined to curse it and swallow everything up. That Arlen always said Baam was a monster. And here again, there's plenty to say. Well, it's already obvious, and I more or less hinted at it in the video on Baam's powers, but you can immediately see the link between the power that the god of the outside has instilled in Baam, this sun that devours everything, and the fact that Arlen believes that Baam is a monster destined to swallow everything up. It's this change that the god of the outside made in Baam, which she hadn't foreseen in her first prophecy, that prompted her to make a second one that's both identical and radically different, where Baam suddenly goes from being the tower's savior to the one who will condemn it. And that's why he's been locked in this cave by Arlen, in this part dug into the tower's walls, technically located outside of it, so that he remains isolated inside forever, so that the very idea of entering the tower never occurs to him, even though he can open its doors by his own will. Moreover, if we're to go any further, there's one point that must necessarily be addressed, and that's the question of what became of Arlen after all this. Because if she's really stuck in the tower as I think she is, she's either still hiding or, and this is my theory, she's simply already dead. But not in any way, I think it was Baam himself who killed her, that he devoured her. First of all, Arlen is immortal, like all the great warriors except V, but this immortality contract is a contract, it only works inside the tower, not in Baam's cave. Then we might find it frankly abusive that Baam could kill an irregular like Arlen when he was just a kid, but in the cave, without Shinsu, an irregular is, logically, not much more than an ordinary human. But Baam isn't an ordinary human, he's been given the power of what Arlen calls a god, or at least a small part of it. It's all a bit vague, so I'm not going to go too far and start talking about Exis, but it's true that it's a bit reminiscent. I'll refer you to the lore video on Tulsi User Story if you're interested, and anyway, we'll develop that another day in another theory. In short, since we know, again according to this theory, just in case, that Arlen saw Baam as a monster, and that, on top of that, the god of the outside, on whom she was counting to get out of the tower, condemned her to stay there, it's quite possible that one day, not like any other, in a fit of rage, she entered Baam's cave to vent her hatred on him, assaulted him, and even tried to kill him, and he fought back in survival mode with the power of the god of the outside, and simply devoured her. There are other points that somewhat support this theory, but to talk about them, we have to talk about Rachel. Because if there's one more mystery surrounding this whole story, it's how Rachel met Arlen. Well, as I said, I think Rachel lived on the 43rd floor, right where Arlen had moved in, right where the entrance to Baam's cave was. Because Arlen wasn't alone there were also a few tower inhabitants who survived there as best they could and who probably gathered around Arlen to survive and make their own society and continued to do so after her death. So, did Rachel know Arlen? Well, not really, or at least indirectly, as Azrael said in his own theory. Indeed, it's thought that Rachel never knew Arlen except through books, because as with the pocket found by Jahad and then by Garam, Arlen continued to write after that, writings that Rachel found after her death, in which she spoke of those stars she wanted so much to see again, of the fact that Baam was a monster, and so on. What leads us to believe this is, first of all, that we know very well that Rachel was nothing. One of the few things we know about her past is that she says she was used to tidying up and cleaning things from an early age. She was a maid, basically. And there's little chance that such an ordinary person could have had a conversation with someone like Arlen, especially as the society that seems to have built itself around Arlen really didn't seem to be happy and egalitarian. It was a dark place, which Rachel hated. But also, most edifying of all, is how little Rachel knows about the tower when she enters it. Everything she knows seems to be taken from a children's story. She asks Hedden if he's the elf of the tower at the beginning, even telling him, "I read you in the book. In the tower, there are elves who guide the children who want to climb the tower." Anyway, you really get the impression that everything she knows comes from the books she's read, because that's the only way she knew anything in this dark world where she was destined to do nothing but clean up. Also, I think that Arlen had already been dead for a long time, even before Rachel was born, and that she learned that Baam had killed her from the people she served. Then, having read Arlen's writings about the stars she wished to see again, she set out to make her dream come true in her place, whatever the cost. That's what it really feels like when she says, in the Floor of Death arc, "What I want is just blue skies, endless stars, and a fresh breeze." That incredibly beautiful landscape that this person has been missing all his life. If I can see that landscape with my own eyes, that's enough for me. Also, despite the fact that she's probably only known her through books, Rachel seems to really adore Arlen, between her ultimate dream, which is modeled on this longing for Arlen, and the fact that at the end of the Hidden Floor arc, when in despair, even rejecting Yura's support, she turns to Arlen as if he were the last person in the world who mattered to her. And I also think that part of her resentment towards Baam stems from that, from the fact that he killed Arlen, the person who meant the most to her. That's what she really means when she tells Hayden that Baam has taken everything from her. Moreover, we sense that she's trying to rekindle the subject when she asks him if he knows why she wants to see the stars when she talks to him, just before his betrayal at the end of season 1. She really says this as if it were possible that Baam could answer her, as if it were something he'd forgotten. In the beginning, Rachel probably forced herself to stay by his side in the cave despite this because, understanding who he was, knowing about Arlen's prophecy, she understood that he would be able to open the tower doors, and so she could use it to get into the tower the moment he opened the doors, so she could climb it, reach its summit, and see the stars. That's probably even why she'd gone to see him in the first place, taking a knife with her anyway because, well, Baam was a monster after all, and it was in pursuit of this goal that she ruined Arlen's plan to isolate Baam forever. On Baam's side, the first thing that might seem inconsistent is the temporality. As I said, I don't think Rachel knew Arlen, because I think she had already been dead for some time. And yet, when Rachel arrives in the cave, Baam is still a child, even younger than she is. But this problem can easily be solved by saying that time doesn't flow in the same way inside and outside the tower. There are a few elements that suggest this when you take a closer look at Tulsi Uzer's story, such as the fact that Jahad entered the tower several tens of thousands of years ago, which is a timescale far superior to the little we know of Tulsi Uzer's story, where the story took place over thousands of years at most. Anyway, the point is that time may be passing more slowly in the cave than in the tower, which would explain Baam's slow growth. Oh, and while I'm on the subject, another weird thing is that Baam managed to survive on his own, without food or water, just on completely barren land. And in fact, this could simply be explained by the fact that he doesn't need to eat. Indeed, it's quite amusing that at no point in all of Tower of God does Baam express the need to eat. We've never seen him hungry, and whenever he does eat, it's with others, never in his own corner. Basically, he only eats out of social convention. Anyway, Baam being completely alone in his cave and seeing nothing but a faint light on the ceiling, he piled up a mountain of stone to reach this light, this passage between the outside world and the wall of the 43rd floor. But he couldn't cross this light because to do so would be to enter the tower, to become an irregular. Then Rachel arrived, they met, she educated him, she taught him everything. She'll teach him how to talk, how to think, she'll talk to him about all sorts of things and so on. And I don't think she did it out of sheer calculation. She expected to see the monster who'd killed the person she cared most about, but ended up with a completely innocent kid who was nothing like Arlen's description. And even though she wanted to use him, I think she got really attached to Baam, gradually forgetting what he had done, until a certain event reminded her of his true nature. Yes, that's not where the story begins and this video ends. Indeed, for the sake of completeness, a few more things are going to happen before the first panels of this first chapter. First of all, Rachel names Baam the 25th Baam, which translates as the 25th night, telling him it's because he was born on the 25th night. We don't even know what his real name is, I mean, the name Arlen originally gave his baby, nor do we know what Rachel means by the 25th night, or where she got this information. Maybe it's the same name Arlen gave him, and Rachel just picked it up from one of Arlen's writings, or maybe not, we don't know. Also, on the more anecdotal side, we know that Baam's cave was really huge, to the point that Rachel said she'd never seen a mountain so big in her life, and that exploring the cave was one of Rachel and Baam's main hobbies. Amusing that she'd say this knowing that we're told Enryu raised all the mountains on the 43rd floor too, but anyway. Then, as another question, we have the fact that we find in this cave at one point a symbol that, a priori, has nothing to do there, the symbol of Jahad's empire. This is also one of the main points of speculation, and we think that it is in fact the symbol of the god of the outside, and that Jahad has simply recovered this symbol. Indeed, we could imagine, for example, that the god of the outside was actually the person who sent Jahad into the tower, as a kind of mission, and so Jahad carried his symbol with him. But that Jahad betrayed his trust by stopping the ascent and proclaiming himself king of the tower. All this would explain, for example, why Enryu, the messenger of this god of the outside, accuses Jahad of being a false king. Anyway, all this to say that the symbol in Baam's cave could very well be a symbol representing the god of the outside, as if the cave were an altar dedicated to him, which Arlen built before he betrayed her. But all this is stuff we'll come back to in another theory, as it's linked to a lot of other things. Finally, we think we know where this cave on the 43rd floor is, because it's linked to another Tower of God mystery, a plot that's been going on since the Floor of Death arc, because there's another character we know well who saw the entrance to this cave, Hockney. And I'm obviously referring to his painting, which was divided into 6 pieces, of which he was able to recover 5, and of which the last piece is in the hands of Rachel. At first, he thought this painting indicated the location of one of the thorn fragments, but 3 fragments had already been sent off the Floor of Death, leaving just 1. And it's Gustang who reveals the location of this last fragment before giving it to Baam, in a place with immense Shinsu pressure, where Hockney could never have gone. In short, this painting with the red light, for which Hockney became regular, and which he says contains his soul, may in fact represent the entrance to Baam's cave. And given that SIU has more or less teased that we'll be returning to the Floor of Death one day, there's bound to be something to do with it. But to get back to Baam and Rachel, it's important to note that there are things going on between them in the cave that we don't yet know about. For a start, the Baam who enters the tower is older, taller, and has clothes, cut hair, and so on. But above all, he has a machete. We don't know what the context is when he chases Rachel, what happened before, why he has this weapon, etc. He probably took the weapon to defend himself from something, but we don't know what. But what I find most interesting is a very discreet element that I think many had overlooked, and which will surely be of great importance later on. In chapter 25 of season 1, we see a sort of flashback just before Baam uses the Shinsu for the very first time since his arrival in the tower, without even knowing what it is. We see Rachel having her hair violently pulled back by someone, while he screams inwardly that he must protect her. This suggests that he has already had to protect Rachel from someone, without us really knowing how he did it. In fact, I think that as Rachel went back and forth between the cave and the 43rd floor to come and see him, after a while she got caught, people noticed her and wanted to punish her for what she'd done. She fled into the cave, the guy followed her, caught her, and here again. I think that in a moment of distress like that, Baam simply used the same power with which he devoured Arlen, reminding Rachel in the process who he really was. That famous monster who devours everything. And I think it was at this point that Rachel decided to use Baam to get into the tower. That it was this moment that allowed her to have the necessary resentment towards Baam to betray him at the end of season 1, although he did this to save her. Anyway, this theory adds even more complexity to the relationship between Baam and Rachel, and helps explain some of the dialogue and reactions of the 2 characters, so there's that. But to sum up the whole video, there are 2 revelations about Baam's identity. The first is that he's not V's son, but Jahad's son, and the second is quite simply that Baam is already dead, killed by his own father to avoid any possibility of further ascension. Or rather, that he was never resurrected, that the god of the outside only brought to life a corpse into which he inserted part of his power, this sun that devours everything. So who is Baam really? The 25th Knight, as Rachel calls him? The Prince of Jahad? The corpse of this prince, reanimated by a mysterious entity? The innocent child from the cave, evolving in the merciless world of the tower? The savior of the tower? Or the monster who will doom it? Is he merely the plaything of a destiny from which he cannot escape? Does he have a nature, an essence of his own from which he cannot escape? Only time will tell. But now, there would be plenty of questions arising from all this. Why did the god outside do this? What was his real purpose? And above all, why did Jahad stop the tower's ascent in order to become king? All of a sudden, just like that. Why did he go to such extremes to prevent the ascent from resuming? Why does he insist so relentlessly on blocking the 135th floor? What would happen if someone reached the top of the tower? What will happen when the famous Prince of Jahad passes that ultimate test Maxeth speaks of? Why does Maxeth seem so eager to find out? What does Arlen really mean by devour everything when she talks about Baam? Well, that's all for another time, in another theory. A theory that will probably be far more complex than this one, given the number of elements to be taken into account. A theory where we'll have to talk about the end of Tower of God. Well, that's it. We're done with this long theory, mainly centered on Baam, but around which gravitate many other equally mysterious characters, such as Jahad, Arlen, the princes of the Red Light District, Rachel, Maxeth, etc. But also all kinds of elements of the lore, of the plot. Anyway, that's why it's so complex to theorize about Tower of God. Everything is so interconnected in so many ways that it's easy to get bogged down, and you have no choice but to get bogged down, since the great interconnectedness of the storylines means that you have to take everything into account to build a coherent theory. Throughout this theory, I've kept myself from talking about a whole bunch of other subjects that I intend to cover in other theories, including the very big theory that I've teased several times in the video and that we're going to have to do one day, about who are all the real masterminds of this story, as well as the end of Tower of God, of course. But I warn you, it won't be for a while, because it's a mess. This video is also a good reminder to watch all the lore videos, as I intend to rely on them to avoid having to re-explain the same lore elements 50 times and lengthen the videos by 20 minutes. That's why I made them in the first place. And it's a shame to see videos as important as the guides or the atelier videos get so few views compared to the others. Finally, of course, I'd like to thank BaZa for his theory about Baam being Jahad's son. He wasn't the first to think of it, but he's been summarizing, consolidating and carrying this theory for many years, and in the end I've only added recent elements to it, as well as the explanation about the division of the seasons. I'd like to thank Azriel again, who did a lot to build the second part of the video, even if I deviated on a few points on which we don't agree, and in any case I'm posting descriptions of his theory and the BaZa for you to read on your own. And of course I'd like to thank Electrica, as usual, because it's also thanks to him that we're able to gather all this information, compare our theories with a whole host of more or less related elements, etc. And more generally, it's thanks to our discussions together that we come up with this kind of theory, so it's never really an individual job. Then, of course, it's just a theory. There are lots of little speculative elements that I've touched on that could very well be different in the webtoon without necessarily calling the whole theory into question either. And of course, conversely, the main theory could be completely wrong and everything around it still be true. And in any case, if the theory were 100% sure, it would just be an explanation of the plot, not a theory. And besides, chances are there are inconsistencies in this theory that I've missed, so yeah, don't take what I say at face value, stay skeptical, and feel free to bash me in comments if you ever see any, as long as you have solid arguments. In any case, if we strip away the speculative side, I think this kind of theory is a very good way of highlighting plot elements so that we realize their importance and ambiguity and know that it's probably in these very subtle little passages that part of the answer to questions that will be resolved in 500 chapters is already to be found, which also serves to highlight SIU's incredible work in building the story. Anyway, that was my first theory on Tower of God. It was a big mess, but I hope you liked it anyway, that I stayed clear and didn't lose you with all the info and mini theories surrounding this big theory. You can subscribe, like, comment, share, all that. You can also check out the videos I've mentioned, and we'll see each other again in the next video, hoping it'll be a little less messy. Bye.